Right, it's time for us to get going again. And today we're on lecture 6 of your notes. And we're thinking about Old Testament narrative. Get it right, rather. Get it right. What are we trying to get right? We're trying to get Old Testament narrative right. What have we covered so far? You remember over the last few weeks, we've been thinking about the importance of studying the context of an Old Testament story. We've spoken about the importance of making good observations of the text and in the text. We looked at the importance of discovering a plot in the story. Why is the story there? Where are we headed towards? What's the point of it all? Where have we come from? Where are we going? Then we've asked the question, how do we get there? And we've looked at the setting. Every story is set somewhere. We looked at a map earlier. Certain stories are set in particular places. If you think you're in this place, but actually you're in that place, it's certainly going to affect things a great deal. Setting, where you are, when something is taking place, not necessarily what year, but what era, where are we in terms of the covenants. And then we also looked last week at the characters that make up a story. As I am looking out at a rather complex group of people, so it is that there are complex people in the Bible, and we need to wrestle with those characters to find out more about them so that we can be helped in understanding that particular story. So those are the first few steps that help us to determine what God was saying then. But what is he saying to us? When you read these Old Testament stories, what is God saying to us? Is this just a history lesson? If you love history, if you love reading the life and times of the ancient Romans, or if you like, I suppose there are a bunch of girls in front of me, the Victorian eras of these horrible dramas on TV that us men sometimes have to sit through and watch with you. And enjoy. My trouble is to try and stay awake. And it's just, I don't know. When I see a long dress on TV, I go into another place. My heart is saying, I don't want to watch this at all. And anything would be better than this. Gee, Casey, thank you. When you're watching those dramas, when you're reading actual historical events, World War stuff, ancient time periods, ancient history, when you're reading those things, you don't necessarily think to yourself, what is this saying to me? If you read about the Second World War or Vietnam, you don't say, how does this impact my life? Because it's not, especially. Yeah, that's right. If you see something in the news that's about you, it could be a mental illness. That's right. But when you are reading the Bible, I hope you don't think that way. I hope you don't just read the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and your favorite Old Testament stories, and you say to yourself, well, this is just history. This is just a few of the building blocks that make up the coming of Jesus. We don't want to see that. We don't just want to say, these are our forebears, this is our family, this is how I got to be where I am today. Because Old Testament narrative has got much more to say to us than just that. It has something to say to us also at a personal level, not just a historical level. And so we want to move from studying the plot and the setting and the characters to seeing what it has to say to us today, moving from them, then, there, if you like, them, then, there, to us here, now, us here today. But how do we do this? How do we do this? How do we move from the ancient world and the ancient story to our 21st situation? Well, here's a few options. You could, if you like, helps if I turn it on. You could, if you like, go on. No, don't do that. You could, if you like, read the stories literally. Do you think that that is what we should be doing? Should we take what was said to them then there and transfer it directly to us? Now, you all say no. But what about something like Gideon and his fleece? How many times haven't you heard someone say, I've put a fleece out on this matter? What do they mean? They mean God must tell me somehow. I've asked God to make something visible to me like he had made something visible to Gideon. And when he's made it visible to me, then I'll act on something. I used to put a fleece out. I was about 8 at the time. But I used to put a paper and pen next to my bed and say, God, if you want me to do it, you write yes on here. And if you want me not to do it, write nothing on here. So God said no a lot of the time in my life. I didn't quite work out that I should have asked him to write no. It would have been clearer. People test God all the time, and a lot of it comes from that idea of, let me put a fleece out, like Gideon did, make the ground wet. Lord, if it's like this, then I'll do this. If it's like that, the story of the missionary. Did I tell you the story about the missionary? He's trying to decide how to go on the mission field. So he puts a fleece out. He says, Lord, will you give me a sign? Show me a sign that will tell me where to go to serve you. And he goes into Pick and Pay. And there's a big sale in the chocolate department. And the chocolates that are for sale in this great special offer are all Brazil nuts. And so he goes to his pastor and he says, Pastor, I know where to go and serve the Lord. And the pastor says, well, where are you going to serve the Lord in the mission field? He says, I'm going to Brazil. The Lord has shown me I must go serve him in Brazil. So I asked the Lord for a sign. And he gave me the sign, Brazil. And the wise old pastor said, I'm glad it wasn't a special on Mars bars that day. You see the problem? If you read literally, you can read into things all the time in different ways. So is that what we do? Now, what do you do then if you're reading the story about the conquest of Joshua over his enemies? Now, you've got this particularly difficult person in your life. And now you go and read the conquest of Joshua, and it says he devoted them to complete destruction. And he burnt them to a cinder. He killed them with a sword. And now you've got this issue that you read the Bible literally in your life. That's the way you think it's the right way. What do you do when you stand before the enemy now? You think to yourself, well, my Bible reading this morning said, Joshua devoted his enemies to complete destruction. And here is my enemy before me now. So I should... You see, it's just a nonsense. If you're going to read that use that method systematically throughout the Old Testament, you're going to get yourself into heaps of trouble. So, tip 1, don't do that. Should we spiritualize? Here's another option. Instead of just reading things literally, I could perhaps spiritualize matters. I could read my story, and I look for a spiritual interpretation. So you read the story of Jericho, for example, and they march around the city 7 times, and then they blow the trumpets and the walls blow down, and the Lord gives it to them. It becomes their city. Now, you might spiritualize that story, and many, many people do. They claim things. Have you heard about people claiming things? They claim territory. They claim businesses. They claim homes. And they say, this is God's. And they get it from stories like that one. They've spiritualized the story of Jericho. They walk around it 7 times. So you have these prayer walks. You have people taking an area, and they march around a particular area, and they say, this area is now the Lord's. It might be the area around their church or around their house. I've had phone calls asking me as the pastor from strangers coming to their house to bring blessing into their house, to come and claim it for God. And I think you probably get it from stories like this one of Jericho. That's looking for a spiritual meaning in the story for day-to-day practice. Should you perhaps moralize? I presume you understand that I mean to spiritualize a story is not what we do either. Should we moralize the story thirdly? Maybe the stories are there so that we can simply learn lessons from the various characters. So you look at Jonathan, the story of his friendship with David, and you say to yourself, I need to be a better friend. The story of Jonathan is there to teach me to be a good friend to those around me, those who I say are my friends, who I love. I should be like Jonathan and lay my life down for them. Well, it's a good thing to do, but is that why the story's there? Or I must learn from Jacob. I mustn't be a deceiver. You know, what goes around will come around. As Jacob deceived, so he was deceived. So I mustn't do that. Is that why the story of Jacob is there? Well, that is to moralize. But that, of course, introduces legalism and failure, because not everyone is able to do what those characters did. And, of course, we fail. We don't do always what they did, nor should we always do what they did. So to moralize is also not the right option to make. No, we want to do something a bit different to all of that. We want to read stories. Here's a big word for you for the day. And to see in them a Christocentric focus. What do you think that means? That the stories of the Old Testament, we should understand them as being centered on Christ, on Jesus. And the key verses for you to think about with this is Luke 24, verses 44 to 47, where Jesus tells his disciples, as they meet him after his resurrection, that the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms are about, what's his words? They are about me. His key word there in that little sentence is me. If Jesus says the Old Testament stories are about himself, what do you think the Old Testament stories are about? Jesus. Okay? If you don't like that, then take it up with Jesus. That's not my idea, that's his idea. He says that the Old Testament is about himself. That the focus of the Old Testament is Christocentric. And so I am to come to the Old Testament with that in my mind above all things. I am not going to read a message into it literally, or I'm not going to spiritualize the message or moralize it. No, I'm going to say to myself, the first thing that I'm to learn from this story in my interpretation and understanding and application of it today is that it is going to be focused on Jesus. Now, I mustn't now say, right, I know it's about Jesus somehow, so I'll have to read it literally, or I'll have to spiritualize, or I'll have to moralize. You know, don't read it that way. I'm not saying you do that. For example, Jacob was a deceiver, the moralized one. Jacob was a deceiver. I must rather be like Jesus. Jesus was never a deceiver. I'm not saying do it like that. Nor am I saying that you should spiritualize something. Rahab dropped a scarlet cord out of her window. I know it's about Jesus, so scarlet is close to red. Jesus, red blood. Jesus died. The scarlet cord is a representation of Jesus' blood on the cross being shed for me. Okay, that is spiritualizing. Even though you're saying that Jesus is the heart of the story, you are reading into that story something about Jesus that was never intended to be there. And so don't do that either. Don't just say, I know it's about Jesus. You know the other story about the Sunday school boy? What's small and grey, it's got a fluffy tail, pointy ears, it eats acorns, sleeps a lot during winter. You know, it's right about this big. What is that? And the little boy puts up his hand. He says, I know the answer is Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. You know, so we're not asking you to do that. You know, I know it's Jesus, but I'm going to have to find some really fancy way to get to understand Jesus. So we're going to try and learn how to read and see Jesus as being the heart and focus of a story in a natural way, not in a forced way. You shouldn't have your congregation or your Bible study group saying, scratching their heads and saying, gee, I know my Bible study leader is clever, but they are so clever because they see things that I can never see. Now that's not a compliment to you. That's not what we're aiming to achieve either. So let's try an example. David and Goliath, 1 Samuel 17. What are the possible options for teaching David and Goliath? Let's try the literal approach. I guess you don't need too many reminders of David and Goliath. What would be a literal approach? If you use these methods that I've just highlighted for us. A literal approach, you might say, well, carry stones around in your pocket because you never know where you're going to meet a giant. Have a slingshot, take regular practice, and when there's someone who's annoying you, kill them. Now, it's not even an option. It's not even close to being in your thought. So you would never read it literally. That's a poor example of literal reading, but you might spiritualize it like this. When you face giants in your life, do you have a giant in your life? What is the giant in your life? Is it unemployment? Is it your boss at work? Is it your health? Is it your finances? What is the thing that dominates you? When you have that giant in your life, that relational problem, that illness, that bereavement, God will be with you even as you fight that giant. Now let's think about the weapons that you must use when you fight that giant. You must fight that giant with prayer and Bible reading and faith and fellowship and have hope and love and patience. That's the most common reading of the story of David and Goliath. I reckon if we found 20 churches in Durban and we asked the pastors to preach David and Goliath this coming Sunday, I reckon 18 of them would do that. They'll tell the congregation, we all have giants in our lives, and you can kill your giant if you use the right weapons against them. That's the most common. And people will love the sermon. If you want to be a great preacher, go and preach that sermon. Guaranteed, they'll love it. Because have you got a giant in your life? All of you do. You're nodding. You say, yes. I wish I knew what January next year held. Because I'm really confused and it's already August, nearly September. I'm really confused. I don't know if I should have that extra baby or not. Or, extra baby, have a baby, get married. Or I haven't passed my exams. I don't know what to do. And God says, face your giant. And you need weapons against your giant. And people will leave church saying, oh, yes, I know what to do now. I know how to conquer the beast. And they'll feel great. But I reckon it's 18 out of 20 churches will go that route. And it will be terrible. I reckon the 19th church will moralize it. And they'll say something like, let's remember that good always triumphs over evil. As long as you set out and do what is right, you will eventually have victory over evil. That is to moralize. Now, I'd like to suggest that there should at least be one church out of 20 that will do a slightly better job. And hopefully it's your church that's going to be that 20th church, and your pastor who will preach it something like this. To say, David was an unlikely hero. Remember? Which number son was he? 7th of Jesse's sons. And a shepherd boy. He wasn't even in the lineup when Samuel came around. Oh yes, I've got one son. What's his name again? He's the shepherd boy. What's your brother's name? It's almost like that. David. Oh, okay, let's bring David. He's an unlikely hero because that's how he's been chosen. And at this point, he is a young boy himself. He's not a mighty king. So when he stands before Goliath, everyone's laughing. From Goliath to King Saul, to the armies of the Philistines, to the armies of the Israelites. But this is 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 16, the previous chapter, is the chapter that we know about. And that says that David has been anointed as king. So now we know that the anointed king is standing before Goliath. And when it comes to the battle, we know that he is victorious in battle over the giant because of who God has anointed him to be. He is the king of God's choosing. And God's enemies must be defeated. And the king is the one who will bring that defeat. And so God is proved faithful in his victory in David's life. As a result, there were tremendous celebrations by the Israelites over the Philistines because of the victory in battle. Yet we must remember that another king was promised. For David is now long dead. But to David, God once promised a king. a king who would live forever. And we meet in the New Testament a man called Jesus, who, like David, seems very unlikely. I mean, really. Questionable parentage, born in a stable, father a carpenter, from Nazareth, rejected by his family and friends, hated by the religious leaders, died on a cross. Very unlikely that anything could ever come of him. What a dreadful story that paints. Yet, in the midst of that story, we see him truly to be God's king because of his authority over his enemies. Sin and disease and death all bow before Jesus. Even in his own death is he raised to life in resurrection and announced and proclaimed as God's eternal king. Yes, Jesus seems very unlikely, but God was faithful and Jesus was victorious over his greatest enemies. And it leaves us one thing to do. Like the Israelites then, we should celebrate and rejoice in the victory of our king over his enemies. And so do you see what's happened in my retelling of that story? Not spiritualizing, not moralizing. I'm saying to myself, I must have a Christocentric focus. Jesus must be the key in my teaching. And I've read it in a very natural way. I've gone the route of, let me think of David as the anointed king. Who is the anointed king of the New Testament? It is Jesus. The usual way is that people draw the line. When they read the story of David, what do? They go from David over here, and they say, I am David. And that's what we must not do. They say, I am David. I've got enemies in my life. And what I need is to exercise weapons against my enemy. But if I'm reading with a Christocentric focus, what am I rather doing? I'm drawing my line from the hero to the real hero, who is Jesus. And I'm asking, who is this David? Who is this Jesus? Anointed king, anointed king. What is the weapon by which the enemy is defeated? Well, it's a little stone. That's all we're told. It's just a stone from the brook. What is the weapon that Jesus used against his enemies? Well, it is his own death on the cross. The weapon is the most surprising thing. His blood shed is the means by which his enemy is defeated. And then as we talk about enemies, we ask ourselves the question, who was the enemy? David had an enemy, a clear one, Goliath. Who is the enemy that Jesus defeats? Well, we see it as sin and death and God's judgment, all defeated by Jesus in one action, by his death on the cross. And so I'm moving from David through Jesus. But when I move through Jesus, I can then move to myself. See, the natural line then is, if you notice, if you know and acknowledge that you have enemies in your life, the enemies that Jesus defeated, sin and death, the devil himself. How are you going to defeat your enemies? What are you going to do? You're going to throw stones at them? You're going to try and live a good life? No, you're going to go to Jesus who defeated those enemies. See, that's how we get from myself to the enemy. It is through Jesus. It is not through David and his slingshot. It's through Jesus and his death on the cross. You are not God's anointed king. I know that may come as a surprise to you this Wednesday morning, and I ask you to live with that and bear with that fact, but that's Jesus. To move from David to yourself would be blasphemy. To go through Jesus, who is the truly anointed king, will give you a depth and of meaning to that story that will far transcend simply saying the boss at work is my enemy and I need to deal with him through such and such a weapon. Dealing with your enemies, the right enemies, in Jesus, through Jesus, will have lasting value in your life. not just a temporary solution. Katie?
Do you think that the reason that 18 of the churches, of the 20, do incorrectly interpret the stories is because they just have a lack of Bible teaching themselves?
The question is, why do 18 out of 20 churches, which is my own little statistic for the day, 99% of statistics are made up on the spot here, of course you know. Why do they do that? It is, I think, partly because they did not attend Entrust's first course of the year, the Bible overview, which I have tried to hammer into your heads at every week, that the Bible overview, ultimately, each section is pointing to Jesus in some way. It is not something that comes easily or naturally to us unless we give ourselves to a serious amount of study. So, the vast majority of you would probably have done with the David and Goliath story what I mentioned a few minutes ago. You would have done that maybe a year or two ago. I'm guessing. Forgive me if I insult you. But I reckon that's the natural thing. We are quite self-centered. David, I must be David. Except when he's sleeping with Bathsheba. Then I mustn't be. So I think it is because people haven't grasped Luke 24, which says that the Bible is about Jesus. And of course, on a pragmatic level, on a practical note, I mean, people like to hear those sermons about themselves. Who would you rather hear about? I mean, the world revolves around me, doesn't it? Doesn't the world revolve around you? Would you rather hear a sermon about yourself or about Jesus? I mean, Jesus might be quite confrontational. You don't really want to confront people, do you? I mean, if you hear this sermon, you're going to hear that you are being conquered by an enemy. That's not a very popular message today. Do you know that you are being overcome by your enemies? What do you mean? How you insult me to say that I am not bigger than my enemies? I have no enemies that I can't conquer myself. That's the dialogue going on between the preacher and the one in the pew, saying, no, come, I can do this. I'm a self-made man. Did you know who I am? Do you know what I've achieved in life? Do you really think I need anyone's help? This sermon is saying you need help urgently. Your enemies are surrounding you. You're about to be killed. Your head is about to be chopped off. And it's going to last for eternity. You need outside assistance because you have screwed up. What are you going to do about it? This sermon says turn to Jesus. Trust in his weapons, not yours. Because he is the eternal king, the anointed king, not you. So this sermon calls for humility and submission. Do you want to hear about humility and submission when you go to church? I don't. I want to be built up and made to feel like a conqueror. You are David. You'd rather hear that. Of course you would. So why do you think certain churches with certain messages grow to a certain size and others who focus on Jesus, well, they don't always grow quite as big? No, by God's grace, many churches who focus on Jesus do grow wonderfully big. But it's not normal. In my view of the Christian world, those who focus on a message focused on me are hugely more popular than those churches who focus on Jesus. You see, because even non-Christians would like to hear about the story of David and Goliath, if you can be David. And a non-Christian will think to himself, yes, I can be David. I am David. And so you'll have lots of non-Christians who sit in churches like that. They are not being taught to turn to Jesus. They don't become Christians. And so they're just big churches. I reckon I can empty those churches pretty quickly. Well, I think I probably need 4 weeks. The first week they'll say, oh, that was an interesting message. Second week they'll say, oh, that message is a bit different. Third week, that message is a bit annoying. It's getting a bit monotonous now. I need Jesus every week. Fourth week, I don't think I'm going to come back. I think that's all I need. 1 week to surprise them. Second week to amaze them. Third week to annoy them. Fourth week to drive them away. But by God's grace, there will be some who get converted, and that's of greater importance than people just feeling happy. Okay, rant for the day over. 1 Samuel chapter 7 is where we're going. No more easy stories like David and Goliath, because you know that one quite well. 1 Samuel 7 is a less well-known story, so let's turn there. Can I let the rant continue? Can you see that in the preaching that spiritualizes or moralizes, can you see why it will grow physical numbers? Can you see, though, do you acknowledge that this is more biblical and will grow people in the right way, namely in spiritual maturity and with conversion growth? So you really need to believe that in your heart, because if you in 15 years' time are involved in a ministry that is focused on Jesus but is smallish, the voices are going to get louder in your head to change your message. Now, none of you, I doubt that any of you, are going to go the route that says Jesus wasn't really God. You're not going to go that route of saying, Jesus accepts homosexuality too. We accept everything. You probably won't go that route. You're not going to become that sort of heretic, that sort of false teacher. You'll become a more subtle false teacher. The false teacher that preaches in the way that we have spoken now. The Bible is still being used, but it's being used to teach about me rather than Jesus. So their constitution will still say we are Trinitarian, we are people who believe in the sovereignty of God, in the salvation through Jesus alone, the cross, the Holy Spirit. None of those things are going to be thrown out. Just the emphasis is slowly going and quietly and subtly going to move off Jesus onto me. You'll see it in the singing of songs. You'll sing more about self, about me, my praise, rather than the glory of God. That's the temptation that you will face. And I think it is likely that over the years that I'm teaching here, some of my students will give into that voice. Just because it's hard when the numbers are small and when money is required and when others are growing bigger. Tupelo spoke about that this morning in his sermon, didn't he? He said, Peter and John, you compare yourself, the temptation of comparison. And you look at another church and you say, well, what's their secret? What's their formula? And then when you look at this and you see what it results in, you start saying, well, let me amend mine a little bit. So I don't throw Jesus out. I just make him a little bit more set aside in the corner. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 7. Will somebody please read it loudly for us? Verses 1 to 13.
Then all the people of Israel turned back to the Lord. So Samuel said to all the Israelites, if you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourselves of the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths, and commit yourselves to the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines. So the Israelites put away the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and served the Lord only. Then Samuel said, assemble all Israel at Mizpah, and I will intercede with the Lord for you. When they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. On that day they fasted, and there they confessed, we have sinned against the Lord. Now Samuel was serving as leader of Israel at Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. When the Israelites heard of it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. They said to Samuel, do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines. Then Samuel took a suckling lamb and sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel. At that day, the Lord thundered his loud thunder against the Philistines, and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them all the way to a point below their calf. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shem. He named it Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued, and they stopped invading Israel's territory. Throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines.
Thank you. 1 Samuel 7, 1 to 13. What I'm going to read to you now is out of one of these little devotional books. You know, these little books that you can buy at the shop, and you can read them for your quiet time. They'll give you the reading. So there you've just read 1 Samuel 7, 1 to 13. It's a story that you don't know so well, am I right? This is not David and Goliath. This is not Jonah. This is not Abraham sacrificing Isaac. This is a little-known Old Testament story that is not exactly making you leap for joy right now, right? This is not a heroic story. This is not even in the top 20. This is not even top 50 on the chart toppers. But here's the devotion. For 20 years, the ark stayed with Eliezer, and during this time, the people of Israel had a revival. They put away their idols and began serving Jehovah only. They had a meeting at Mizpah to confess their sins of idol worship and receive God's forgiveness. This time was appropriately observed with fasting. They wanted to take the matter to God when they heard of an impending Philistine attack. Wow, this is exciting and encouraging. Oh God, would you let this happen in my nation? I think a major factor in this revival was that Israel had godly leaders. Careless Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas were now replaced by godly Abinadab and Eleazar. And the prophet Samuel was a major leader, whereas there had been no prophet earlier. Oh God, how wonderful it would be if truly godly men could fill the seats of my nation's government. I'm kind of surprised that those superstitious Philistines decided to attack Israel again after the ark incident. But the Israelites were all in one place, and since they had come for a religious ceremony, they probably were not armed for battle. The Philistines had them now, and the Israelites remembered how they had been slaughtered the last time by the Philistines. But they cried out to God. Their strength had not won last time. Their carrying the ark with them did not win last time either. They cried out to God and asked their godly leader to cry out to God for them too. They were right before God this time. They had ditched their idols and confessed their sin, and they were worshipping and praying to God wholeheartedly. And God answered by frightening those superstitious Philistines, this time with thunder. The men of Israel, notice, just the men were in the army, pursued the fleeing Philistines and whooped up on them. I guess that's a truly American saying. The setting up of monuments commemorating God's work is a good thing to do. This was a big deal, the subduing of the Philistines, and Samuel wanted this to be remembered throughout the generations, that God did it when the people were right before him. Lord, let me be a godly leader like Samuel. Let me always confess my sins to you and keep you on the throne of my life, not displacing you with anything. Let me always cry out to you in trouble, and let me always remember to thank you for your deliverance and somehow record it for the generations to come, what you have done for me. You can imagine your day starting like that. Yeah, those are good things to pray for. It's not wrong. The stuff that he's written, the facts are true. Lord, help me to confess my sins. That's a good prayer. Help me to keep you on the throne of my life. That's good. Always cry to you in trouble. Let me always remember to thank you for your deliverance. Let me tell others about you. Those are good things, right? You're not struck here by heresy. This is not false teaching. But what are the problems from that? As I was reading that devotional, what struck you from what we were saying earlier? It's not Christocentric, which means that Jesus didn't get a single mention in the devotion. That was the whole devotion. I never left anything out. That's the whole thing.
It sounds like you're being told if you behave, then God will do something.
Okay, sounds like your behavior could result in certain actions on God's part.
Which is terribly demoralizing. You think you're okay.
Yeah, it's very demoralizing. Yeah, what happens when things go wrong? It must be your fault. Yeah.
Focus seems to be on the godly leaders
Yeah.
instead of Jesus.
Yeah.
So also moralistic, not from them.
Yeah, so I must learn morals from the godly leaders, and I must be a godly leader. Godly leaders are required. That's not it's not false teaching. Leaders should be godly. But is this passage teaching me how to be a godly leader? So these are the questions that we are struck with. And we're going to try and work out some of the answers now. As the author of this devotion goes straight from them to us today. Right, you've got a few questions there. Number one, are the characteristics of a plot evident in this narrative? What are the characteristics of a plot? Introduction, problem, resolution, and outcome. Are they evident? What is the narrative about? How is the narrative developed? Divide the passage into those things. And here's a hint, there may be more than one problem and more than one resolution. In other words, there is more than one problem, and it's a subtle hint that, like, listen to the hint. Okay, so do that with your friends around the table very quickly, and as best as you can in the short time that we have, and then we'll move on to the next one. Jillian and Tyron, feel free to do the same and send through some stuff on the chat section to give me some ideas as to how you guys are working it out. If you're watching this on YouTube, take a few moments and do this yourself too, and see how close you can, how closely you can work it out from what I share with the class in a few minutes time.
Yeah.
What she's talking about is it's really up to the taking stuff, but it's not mentioned as just
So they've given up. But
Yeah,
it's
right.
still. So did you see in verse 3? It says, He will deliver you out of the hand of the enemies. They still are. So right there, you're worshiping the wrong God, so you're not going to get.
Right, shall we see if we can come to some sort of agreement? There's never enough time, I'm afraid. We've got quite a few questions to get through. Your introduction, problem, resolution, outcome. How did you divide it up? What was the introduction? Verse what? Verse 1 and 2, I think, is our introduction. Did you have that? The ark is in Israel. It has been now for 20 years, but Israel are unhappy. Okay, things are not going well for Israel. All the people of Israel mourned and sought after the Lord. Okay, it's not a time of happiness for them. Introductions are followed by problems, and I've suggested to you that there's more than one. So what did you say was the first problem? Right, so in verse 3, you've got the fact that there's idolatry taking place. Israel is serving foreign gods. And what else is their problem? And did you see that verse 3 also says that the Philistines were against them? Those problems are linked to one another. Because they have given themselves over to foreign gods, the Philistines are against them. It's taking on the pattern of the book of Judges. Right, what do they do? What's the first resolution? What's the resolution to this problem? I've said it's verses 4 to 6. What happens in verses 4 to 6? They turn and they confess their sins. And it begins with Samuel saying to them that that's what they should do. In verse 3, he had said that to them. That's what they should do. And then they do it in verse 4 by gathering together at Mizpah. They fasted, they confess, we have sinned against the Lord. And that happens in verses 4 to 6. That's a resolution to their problem. Then when you read verse 7, what do you notice? There's another problem. When the Philistines heard that the Israelites had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. And when the Israelites heard of it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. So now they've got problem number 2. This one here was problem 1. This is resolution 1. And now we get to problem number 2, which is verse 7, which is again the Philistines are gathering and I write there fear. The Philistines are gathering and there is fear amongst the Israelites. What is the resolution for that problem? Did you see it in verses 8 to 11? You've got resolution number 2. The solution to that problem is what? Samuel intercedes. Samuel intercedes for Israel, and God wins the battle for them. Verses 8 to 11, they said to Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines." Then Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered it up as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage the Israelites in battle. But that day the Lord thundered with a loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them back into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to a point below Beth-kar. That's the resolution to the problem. Samuel cries out, makes a sacrifice, God intervenes and wins. Now, the resolutions are followed by outcomes, and in verse 12, you've got the outcome, which is that they set up these Ebenezer stones to remind them of their victory. Ebenezer reminder, we'll call it. And that is outcome number 2. So you see these ones come together. Problems, resolutions, and outcome work together, number 2. And then you see that the passage as a whole ends with another outcome, and that was God is against the Philistines. God is against the Philistines, and that is now outcome number 1. So you see how there's a problem, a resolution, and an outcome within a problem, resolution, and outcome. So one is a big issue is solved, and the other one is in the heart of the big issue, a smaller issues that, hey, it's like a war, a battle within a war. Okay, so you've got the Second World War, but as part of that war, there are numerous battles, and here that's what's going on, in a sense. Okay, so you could say that there's a story within a story, concentric circles, if you like. And so the absence of God's ark from Shiloh, that's the problem. The absence of God's ark from Shiloh is being met by repentance. And the outcome is the long-term deliverance of the Israelites from the Philistines. But the second part, the second problem, the Philistine attack at Mizpah, is met by sacrifice and prayer, and the outcome is the Ebenezer stone. Small story within the larger story. Are you okay so far? Given enough time, I think you probably have worked that all out. The story within the story. Secondly, what do we need to notice concerning the setting of this narrative? When and where are the events taking place? A few minutes on that. When and where?
No, it's a person. It's a person. It's a person outside. So that's weird.
Right, setting. What do you notice about the setting? You need to know a little bit about what's going on around. So what have you noticed? Time of the judges. Okay, so that's the big general answer. This is the time of the judges. That's happened previously now, that the ark has been returned. Chapter 5 and 6 tell us that the ark had been residing in Philistia, and Dagon, their god, had been worshipping him night after night. Remember that story? He falls down, his arms break off, legs fall off, pick him up, stick him together with cracklies again, and then he falls down the next night, they super glue him the next night, cable tie him the next night, every night he falls down on his face in worship. And eventually they can't stand the sores and the boils that break out on them, and they send him back, it's not him, send the ark back, being pulled along by some cattle. Remember? Okay. But now how did they get the ark? Do you remember that? So the Israelites in chapter 4 decide, well, let's use the ark as a lucky charm, and we'll take him into battle against the Philistines, and they lose it. Now, see, we're working a bit cockeyed here, a little bit backwards. So how did that come about, that they decided to take the ark into battle? Use it as a lucky charm. They've seen it happen before, in Jericho, I think. When they entered Jericho, the ark of the covenant led them. They went round and round the city walls, and then there was victory. I think that's the thinking. It's happened before. We can use God again in this way. And that was all brought about by Samuel's sons. If you turn to the beginning of 1 Samuel, which is the easier and more natural place to start than what we've been doing, working backwards, in chapter 1, 2, and 3, you'll notice that the ark is residing at Shiloh. When Samuel is born, and when he's dedicated, when Hannah is praying, everything is happening in Shiloh. But then in chapter 4, the ark gets taken from Shiloh into battle and is captured by the Philistines and then resides in Philistia before being returned. Now the question was not only but when and where, but where in terms of biblical history. So you said to me that it happened at the time of the Judges. What just defined that time in chapter 8? 1 Samuel chapter 8 is one of our top 20 chapters of the Old Testament. What are they requesting in chapter 8? We want a king. Even though God is king, they decide that they want to have a king to rule over them. So this story happens very neatly between the Judges and the beginning of the monarchy. And if you think about what's going on in this story, namely, it is a repentance story, what has been happening beforehand, the first 7 chapters, or the first 6 chapters, it's been a dark time in Israel's history. Do you remember on our graph earlier this morning? There was that low point. The glory of God departs, they request another king. Remember that? That's 1 Samuel 4 and 1 Samuel 8. Our story comes right in between. So here's a highlight story, a good story in the midst of massive Old Testament tragedies. The ark is captured, they renounce God as their king. And here in the middle is a little story about repentance. So you jot all that down and you think, well, let me store that away for a minute. Let me see what I'm going to make of that. Hard work, eh, Tracy? You keep your wits about you. What's easier, accounting, doing entrust books, or doing this? Entrust books balance more easily, hey? And that's because we have so little money. That's why. Right, who are the main characters in the story, and what do you need to notice about them? Well, I'll help you on this one because Tracy's getting a bit weary. We've got the one major character is Israel as the whole covenant community. They've come together, they're in Mizpah, and for once they are repentant. You know, when you see Israel doing well, highlight it in your Bible. There won't be many highlights in your Bible, but highlight it and say, gee, this is an unusual event. There is repentance. Israel is the first character. Secondly, Samuel is the major character. And he comes in here into the story as a mediator. That's who he is in the story. He's a mediator. He's standing between God and men. He is offering sacrifice on the people's behalf. The question that we also have in our minds, because we've now been reading the first 8 chapters, is could Samuel perhaps be the chosen prophet or the promised prophet of chapter 2, verse 35? Did I say prophet? I meant priest. Chapter 2, verse 35. There we are told, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister my anointed one always. We say to ourselves, could Samuel be that priest? Because here in our story, what is he doing? He's acting as a priest by making a sacrifice. So with chapter 2 in my mind, I think maybe Samuel has moved on from being prophet now to also being priest. Because I know he's a prophet. Chapter 3 verse 1 tells us that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. And chapter 3 verse 20 and 21 tells us that the Lord revealed himself to Samuel through his word. Chapter 4 verse 1 says Samuel's word came to all Israel. So I've been told that Samuel is a prophet and he's acting like a priest. So I'm thinking, is he perhaps the one? So I've got Israel as the covenant community. He's the one character. Samuel is the other character. He's a mediator. He's a priest and he's a prophet. Who's the next character in my story? Well, the Philistines. They are the enemies. And in this story, they are acting as opportunists. Here they come together as a group of worshipping Israelites. They're confessing their sins, and the Philistines say, hey, do you hear what's going on? They're praying. Let's go nail them while they're praying. They're opportunists. Who's the other character in our story? This is the easy question. God. Okay. It's always easy to forget God in our stories, and let's try not to do that. In chapter 7, verse 10, our story, 7 verse 10, what does God do? What are we told he does? He thunders. Now, because you've been reading chapter 1 to 8, you also know that chapter 2 has this to say, chapter 2 verse 9 and 10, talking about the Lord. Hannah says in her prayer, chapter 2 verse 9, the Lord, he will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked will be silenced in darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. And so we see that the Lord who was promised in Hannah's prayer to be the thundering God is the God who comes against the Philistines and thunders against them. I love those little things, don't you? It's so nice, so good to see. Okay, so those are our characters. I'm just noting this down, noting down what I can find out about the characters. I haven't just said Samuel is a character. So what? So what? Well, what do I know about Samuel? Well, he's a prophet. There has been the promise of a priest being made, and Samuel is now acting as a priest. Is he the priest who will serve before the Lord forever? Forever? A forever priest? And then there's God, who is the main character. I don't just say God is a character. It doesn't tell me much. I'm looking out for something in the story, and I'm told God thunders. And I think back, and I say, look, chapter 2. God would thunder against his enemies. And then I see the Philistine enemies are opportunists here. Question 4 says, what is the narrator's viewpoint concerning these events? Chapter 7, verse 10 is the narrator's viewpoint. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day, the Lord thundered. You see that he's coming with Samuel's interpretation. He knows, under the divine inspiration of God, that this battle is won by God. The Lord thundered against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. You could say the Israelites had great military strategy that day. They fought a good battle and they won. But the narrator knows something that you and I don't know, and that is, under the inspiration of God, he knows God was the one thundering against them. It wasn't just a military victory, this was a divine victory. That is the narrator's viewpoint. You always know the narrator is speaking when he is saying something that only God could know. To me, this looks like a great military battle. To God, it is a great divine battle, a great divine victory. Yeah, you'd imagine that the warriors of the ancient world are slightly bolder than the man who sits in the tower today and pushes a button that says, missile. Those days you were a real soldier. When you did hand-to-hand combat, you were a man.
It's so amazing that, presuming the thundering was terrifying, that the Israelites were in front.
Yeah, because their God is thundering against their enemies.
But it's good to know.
That's right. Yeah. Because this is a surprising chapter. Remember, we're seeing all the time that this chapter takes us by surprise because they are being repentant. They are acting in line with being the covenant people of God. We are so used to seeing them, using the ark as a lucky charm. We're so used to seeing them chapter 8 stuff, wanting a king like the other nations. We're so used to that. But when we see something good, well, we are surprised. Well, we're not going to get through to the next part, are we? Establish the significance of the story for a contemporary Christian congregation. Will you give that some thought? Mark that down for some homework for yourself. Look at number 1, 2, and 3, those questions, and number 4. And maybe just like to jot down a few things. We'll start there next week and try and establish the significance for a 21st century Christian. You think, what is the story telling you today? Don't moralize it. Don't spiritualize it. Don't read it with absolute literalism. How are we going to see Jesus in the story And then how will we get it through to ourselves today? Okay, so I'll leave that with you for a little bit of homework reading. Do some devotions yourself on 1 Samuel chapter 7. See if the Lord speaks to your heart this week in a slightly better devotion than I read to you earlier today. Right, we'll leave it there. Let's have some lunch. And see some of you after lunch.